Hello listeners, how are you doing? I hope you're doing well and that you're ready for another episode of my podcast. This time, in this episode, I'm presenting you with a conversation with a guest, and that guest is Jon Stewart, who is a university lecturer from Sheffield in England. Before we jump into the conversation, I think I should give you a bit of an introduction here to give you some context and comments to help you follow this episode better. I'll try and keep it short, but I need to just give you some context and stuff. Just in case you don't know, this is a podcast for learners of English around the world. I'm an English teacher and I help people learn English around the world by presenting them with content to listen to. So a bit of support in this introduction will help my listeners to follow this conversation better. These are not comments about specific words or phrases, but just some general information to help place you in the right zone for this conversation, which in turn should help you learn more English from it. Okay, so Dr. Jon Stewart, PhD, to give him his proper title, runs a master's degree course in business and popular music practice at the BIMM Institute in London. That's the British and Irish Modern Music Institute, the BIMM Institute. So he runs a master's degree in music business and popular music practice there. So Jon is an academic who specialises in popular music studies, but also he is a pop star himself. Jon currently plays guitar for a British group called The Wedding Present. And if you're a big fan of British music from the 90s, then you'll probably have heard of The Wedding Present. They're sort of a legendary group in the UK music scene. And also, Jon was a founding member of a band called Sleeper, who were one of the so-called Britpop bands of the 1990s. I remember seeing Sleeper on the TV and listening to them on the radio a lot when I was a teenager in the 90s. So Jon is a proper pop star or rock star, and also a university lecturer, which is a very cool and interesting combination. Jon has written a book, and that's what we're going to talk about mostly in this episode. We start with the book and then we chat a bit about his time as a musician too. So Jon's book, which should be available in all the usual bookshops, is called Dylan, Lennon, Marx and God. It's basically a dual-biography, like a double biography, of Bob Dylan and John Lennon, both of whom are huge cultural figures in the English-speaking world, and probably the non-English-speaking world too, I suppose, but certainly in the English-speaking world. Obviously, Dylan and Lennon wrote pop songs or rock songs, so we are in the realm of popular culture. But I think we can't really underestimate the significance of these two artists, Dylan being from the United States, Lennon being from the United Kingdom. We can't really underestimate the significance of these two artists, not because of where they came from, but just because of the way that their work has been received over the years. The music, the lyrics, and the lives of Bob Dylan and John Lennon are now taken seriously both in academia and just in general life, and their work will no doubt become more and more significant and revered as time goes on, until the point that we look back on the 20th century as a clear, specific period in art and culture, and no doubt Dylan and Lennon will be considered as prime examples of the period. Jon's book is fascinatingly deep and wide-ranging, and it explores not just the life stories of Dylan and Lennon, but also the way both of these songwriters dealt with politics and religion in their songwriting. And so that's the Karl Marx and the God parts of the book title, including the sort of imagery and reference points that can be found in their lyrics and what these things represent about their lives and the environments that they grew up in, as well as the roles of the church and of politics. So as you can tell, this is pretty complicated stuff. To be honest, in this conversation, we only managed to scratch the surface, really. And to get the full details, you'll need to read Jon's book. Now, I am aware that this might be a bit specific and also might only appeal to the fans of Bob Dylan and the Beatles. Long-term listeners will know that I do talk about the Beatles sometimes on this podcast. And you might think, oh no, not more Beatles. Yeah, I know, but I would like to urge you to keep listening to this conversation. Jon is a great guest, and he's very articulate and insightful about his subject. So keep going, keep listening. I think you will learn new things. Plus, there are some pretty good stories nearer the end of the conversation, including a story from Jon about the Imagine piano. That's the piano that John Lennon used to write the song Imagine. It's a great little story, and you should keep listening until the end in order to hear that too. So we're about to start in a moment, I promise, but I would like to point out one more thing. A slight technical problem that we had during the recording, which might make a slight difference to the listening and viewing experience of this episode. So during the recording of this conversation, Jon and I couldn't see each other. Okay, we couldn't actually see each other while we were doing the conversation. We still managed to record our audio and video, but I couldn't see Jon and he couldn't see me during the call. We couldn't see each other. We could only hear each other. And that made it a little bit harder to conduct the interview. And I had to leave Jon to talk without him getting any feedback from me. And by feedback, I mean things like body language stuff. Normally in these conversations, I use eye contact. And, you know, this conversation was recorded remotely. Okay. And as you know, if you've used, you know, you're bound to have done lots of video calls yourselves. Sometimes that can be a barrier to communication. So, especially when you can't see each other. So normally I use eye contact and I use like nodding to encourage my interviewee. And maybe I sort of do a few gestures if I want to jump in and add something or ask a question. But that wasn't really possible this time. And so you might be able to tell. It might make a difference to the general sort of vibe or atmosphere of the conversation. I hope it doesn't change the listening experience too much, but you know, you might be able to tell. And if you're watching the video, you'll see that often we talk without looking at each other. Again, because we'd had to switch off our videos. So when I was editing the video version of this episode, I definitely noticed that I spent quite a lot of time sort of looking down at my desk during the conversation. I was looking down at my notepad rather than looking up at the camera. And honestly, it made it look like I wasn't really that interested or engaged. But I definitely was interested. It's just that I was only focusing on Jon's words and I didn't have his face in front of me to look at. So I just wanted to point that out. Okay, all right. So I've waffled a lot in the introduction to this, and now it's time to meet Jon and listen to him talk about the lives and work of Bob Dylan and John Lennon, two huge figures in the culture of the English language. Now, if you're listening to the audio version of this, I will chat to you again on the other side of this conversation, but the video version ends when the conversation finishes. Okay? Right. So that's enough of my waffling. Let's now meet Jon Stewart, the pop star university lecturer. And here we go. Hello, Jon. Very nice to have you on my podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You're both a university lecturer and a pop star, which is quite an interesting combination. I don't know if you're the only one.
I've met a few. Yeah, there's a couple. Yeah. So what do you do after you've been in a band? I guess a few people have done that. One of the guys from a band called Ocean Colour Scene is a lecturer, Damon Minchella, and one of the guys from Everything is an English lecturer at Newcastle University. Yeah. He wrote me a very nice sleeve note for my book, actually, Alex Niven.
So the book that we're going to talk about, it combines the worlds of academia and pop music, and it's called Dylan, Lennon, Marx and God, which is quite a lot of things contained in one book title. Maybe the best place to start is the title. Can you explain the title and tell us about the book?
Yeah, I did a PhD, and if you're doing a PhD, it's quite involved. So you want to pick something that you enjoy. And my two favourite songwriters have always been Bob Dylan and John Lennon, and no one's ever done a comparison of them. They've been written about hundreds and hundreds of times. But the original approach was to compare their work, really, and their lives. So I did that using two different ways of thinking about it. So Dylan and Lennon is the comparison of their lives and works, which is called a dual-biography, which means looking at two people at the same time. And the idea of a dual biography is you learn more about the individuals through comparing them than you would if it was just a single biography, because they have things in common that you can compare.
Mm-hmm.
And then I look at their politics using a chap from America who was a famous writer on protest music, who was also quite left wing. So he was a Marxist, and an English literature professor. I look at their view on history and their use of history through an English literature professor in America, who's also a very famous literary critic who takes a sort of Marxist view. I'm not a Marxist, but they both are. That's the basis of their academic work. And then I look at their beliefs and ideas using psychology. And so it became Dylan, Lennon, Marx and God, and then an ex-student did a nice cut. I'm showing the cover, a very good graphic, as if they're in a band together, and that was it. Yeah.
I wonder what instruments they would all play if they were in a band.
Yeah, I wonder that it would be quite psychedelic. That's a good word, psychedelic. If you're learning English, I think. Yeah. Good. It would be like progressive rock.
Yeah, definitely. They would definitely be a prog rock band, I suppose. But with John Lennon, they'd have that rock and roll edge to them.
Exactly. I think it'd be quite good.
It would be great. But who would be on drums? Like Karl Marx, surely.
You would, possibly. But then you think God's, it's going to be pretty thunderous. God's like a famous. If you think about it, it's trumpets and drums with God, isn't it?
Right.
It's trumpets and drums. So maybe he'd be like a good drummer.
Pretty heavy John Bonham style.
Yeah, lots of reverb.
Hammer of the gods.
Yes, exactly. Thor on drums. Yeah.
So there's so much in your book. I mean, it's incredibly dense, and it covers so many things. There's so much scope to it. But since this podcast is all about learning English, I thought that we could focus on language. Right, that's the idea.
Yes.
A lot of learners of English around the world are exposed to English first through song lyrics, and maybe through the lyrics of John Lennon and Bob Dylan. It's often the first way that people come into contact with English in a really personal and meaningful way. So let's talk about the way that Dylan and Lennon use language in their music. What can you say about that?
Well, it's fascinating, and it's one of the areas that I look at in their use of history, actually, in because the professor I use as a kind of a frame for it is a literary critic. So with Lennon, for example, he's probably the best one to look at first because it's a little bit simpler. He lived in this kind of fantasy world in his head as a child. He grew up in Liverpool after the Second World War, and it was quite a rough town. It was a port, and there was quite a lot of rebuilding going on. The city had been quite bombed quite badly during the war. In fact, there's a legend that he was born on the night of the Liverpool Blitz, which isn't actually true, but it's a good legend. He thought he was anyway. And he grew up in this kind of lower middle class suburban area with not much to do, and his stepmom, who raised him, Mimi, his aunt, had lots of books. So he just spent his childhood kind of making mischief and being a naughty boy on the one side, which is where the rock and roll comes from, and then reading children's books and encyclopedias and biographies of Churchill and Churchill's own history of Europe and the war. And he uses those references in his work. So the way the Beatles songs go is they're quite easy to understand, the early Beatles music, because it's very simple. It was they tried to make it as simple as they could. And there's lots of I and you, first person pronouns, love me do, and I want to hold your hand, and lyrics that anybody around the world could understand. Because they were marketing themselves as a pop band. And then about halfway through their career, they heard Bob Dylan, who has much more complex lyrics, and began to adopt that style. And at that point, John Lennon went from writing very, very simple first-person love songs to quite introverted songs about his childhood and his memories, and quoting literature. So listeners might know Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland. So he references that in Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Picture yourself in a boat on a river. And he references Edward Lear, The Walrus and the Carpenter, who was a famous English children's poet, really. And these were books that were illustrated books with pictures drawn for children that were famous throughout the 20th century, and Lennon had grown up on them. So there's actually quite a good link there between learning English and listening to John. The I Am the Walrus is his kind of invocation of the Edward Lear image. And then he wrote about his childhood, and famous songs like Strawberry Fields is named after Strawberry Field, which was a children's home over the back of his house. And it's got famous gates that say Strawberry Field on the side, and people put the S in. The Fields works better in plural in the song, but the place is called Strawberry Field, and people sort of correct the name of the place to the song when they go.
Yeah.
Famously, those gates were stolen and then returned, which
really?
is quite
the metal
nice.
The metal gates, really, they were taken.
Yeah, they were stolen. I think in the 90s, and then someone brought them back. I guess they couldn't sell them, and melting them down would have been very, because they featured on a very famous album, a compilation album in the 70s. And songs like In My Life, where he thinks about his childhood. And McCartney did the same, obviously, Penny Lane, and they wrote about the area that they grew up in. If you ever come to the United Kingdom and you're a Beatles fan, you can do the National Trust trip to John's house and Paul's house as well, and it's really worth it. You get a real sense of what it would have been like for them to grow up. And then later, he wrote songs like Mother about his childhood when he reflected on some of the more difficult aspects of it. So he uses children's books, childhood memories, more complex books like the encyclopedia that his aunt had in the house, and the histories of the British Empire, which is interesting as well, because as the Beatles became famous, the British Empire was in retreat. So you might have listeners all over the world learning English, maybe from Singapore or India or different parts of the world that were once part of the British Empire. And during the early 1960s, every year, maybe 3 or 4 countries would leave the British Empire, disassociate from the empire. They would basically formally withdraw and become independent or Commonwealth states. But at the same time, the Beatles were becoming worldwide cultural ambassadors for the United Kingdom. So Britain was replacing its role in the world as a sort of empire with one as a cultural kind of a band singing songs about peace and love, which is quite nice in a way.
Yeah, it sort of went from the different kind of cultural exports, or how to put it.
It's obviously it goes from the sort of the old image of Britain rules the waves to Britain rules the airwaves, I suppose you could say. Which I wish I wish I'd put that in my book. Actually, that would have been quite a good one.
That's very good. You just came up with that right now. Instead
too late. It's already in print.
Damn! There's not going to be a reprint or something like. I must include that line.
No, but I'll throw that in some more interviews maybe.
But it's a really good observation, though. Yeah, that while the British Empire was in retreat, the Beatles, were kind of expanding around the world.
And they were very consciously, they wanted to include music from around the world, so they worked with some of the best musicians from India later on, and John and Paul both became quite sincere, devoted followers of Vedic traditions of one sort or another, and the Indian religions, which are quite ancient, and it's the oldest. The Vedic tradition is the oldest religious text that we know of, or is commonly thought to be, and so he would then include some Indian language in some of his songs. One of the choruses of a chorus of Across the Universe is Jai Guru Deva Om, which was a meditation that he had. So it became quite international and spiritual, and people all around the world obviously were keen on English, so I think that's part of their success, really. And he was also had a vivid imagination, so he sort of expanded his consciousness and wrote lots of songs about peace and love, and Imagine being the perfect example, which is still sung around the world at the Olympics.
I talked about Imagine on the podcast recently, referring to the fact that people often seem to misunderstand what he actually meant by the song. I mean, it is quite commonly misinterpreted, isn't it, and taken up by the people who the song maybe even criticises. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think he'd been on a journey. So John and Bob Dylan, one of the interesting things about them is they go on a sort of a cross journey. They pass each other. So John went from being a pop star to a political figure, and during that journey he experimented with issues like is it appropriate to engage in quite violent protests if things are very wrong, and so that was his song Revolution, where he discusses that in the lyrics of the song, and he ended up saying that wasn't appropriate, and decided that actually if you just try hard enough and think hard enough and wish something hard enough, then it's more likely to happen. So, which is a more sort of spiritual way of looking at it, and a lot of that was through the influence of Yoko Ono, I think. But he kind of arrived there on his own as well. Mm-hmm. And he felt that through you had to change your mind before you could change the world, and that consciousness was a very real thing, and that through mental effort you could almost make good things happen by the right attitude, which is quite an interesting worldview. So, but Bob Dylan went the opposite way. Bob Dylan was a very political figure when he started, and then he retreated from that and became much more abstract in his work to avoid politics and to have more disguised political messages, because in America it was so dangerous to be involved in politics. And of course the irony is that John Lennon was assassinated in 1980 because he was the political Beatle, and Bob Dylan is still alive today because he stepped back from all of that, because he knew the dangers. He was much more cynical than John Lennon. People thought John was the cynical Beatle, but Bob Dylan was much more realistic and hard-bitten, I think. And the irony of Imagine and John's work as an ambassador for peace is that he himself was a victim of political violence, which is another thing I should have put in the book, actually.
Should have spoken to me earlier.
I know, I'm regretting. I'm terribly. Next book I write, I'll talk to you first before it comes out.
Okay. What do you mean when you say that he was killed for political reasons? Because I mean, this is quite a touchy topic, isn't it? This one.
He'd written something. So in America, it's still quite, some parts of America, quite, people have very strong faith and their religion's very important to them. And he'd said some things that upset people, and one of the motivations for his assassination was his writings and speeches in the 60s against formal religion. Yeah. So in that sense, Ringo Starr is known for narrating children's books, so no one's going to attack Ringo, whereas John's the political Beatle, and he had been very political. He did engage in some quite difficult ideas, some of which are quite difficult to support today. He at one point he was supporting some quite radical, but violent movements, and then he backed off from that because he sort of reached a position where he felt that he'd made a mistake there. So he went on this little journey, and Dylan's journey was the opposite. So Bob Dylan started off as very incisive, very forthright protest songs in the early 1960s as part of the folk movement with an acoustic guitar. So if you imagine John Lennon is in a band making lots of noise, the words are perhaps less important because there's a drummer behind you and guitars clanging around. And if you're Bob Dylan and you've just got an acoustic guitar, the words are really important. So Dylan's very interesting to listen to because he's a poet. He wrote words first. So he would write the words of the song and then sing them, work out what the tune was. Whereas John Lennon worked the other way around. And when John Lennon, one of the things that helped change John Lennon's music was listening to Bob Dylan, and he realised how powerful words could be. And Dylan's interesting for different reasons. He was very influenced by American literature and poets from the 1800s. I wouldn't expect listeners to know it because it's not that well known, but there's an American tradition from that period called Transcendentalism, which was a reaction to the world becoming industrial. So they loved nature and they were very spiritual. They looked at different religions from around the world. And if listeners know, there's a church called the Unitarian Church, which is very open-minded. And they were part of that. And they were interested in Indian religions and accepting people from different faiths. And nature and individualism, that was their big thing. Like the individual can find God. I'm not religious, but I'm just sort of interested in how this works. Yeah. So the traditional church, the church that John Lennon reacted against, was more about joining a group and finding God through the church, which is fair enough. And the tradition that Dylan was not part of, but I think influenced by, was more about finding an individual connection to your higher power, whatever that might be. So those themes are throughout Dylan's lyrics. There's lots of Bible metaphors, lots of songs about being true to yourself and standing out on your own, lots of stories about individual characters. So he would try and write a song about, say, racism or poverty, but he would base it around one character, often a true story. Hattie Carroll is a famous one about a famous incident of racism in America. So he wrote the story of Hattie Carroll, and that's a beautiful song. And because he's a poet, I think you could argue he's the greatest pop song lyric writer there's ever been. So it's a little bit more complex than John Lennon, especially Lennon's early stuff. But it's quite rewarding, and there's lots of history to be learned from it, especially Dylan's early stuff, because it's true stories and it's trying to get a message across. And then gradually he became less interested in getting a message across and more interested in the poetry. So he uses metaphors and similes. A metaphor would be saying something is something to describe it, like the answer is blowing in the wind, is Bob Dylan's probably most famous song. Yeah, no one knows what's the answer to this question. No one really knows. The answer's blowing in the wind, and he got that image from a paper bag that was blowing
Wow.
it on a street in the wind. He was sitting in a cafe writing the song, and a bag blew down the street. And so he uses really beautiful images in his love songs and all his songs. He was a great love song writer. If you like love songs, Bob Dylan's love songs are just beautiful. And a great romantic, which is part of that tradition, literary tradition I mentioned earlier. And he also used lots of because he grew up in the middle of America. Lots of his lyrics are based on weather and landscapes. And people don't realize, but if you listen to Bob Dylan's Blowing in the Wind, hard rain's going to fall, buckets of rain, just loads and loads and loads, because in the Midwest in America, the weather changes. It's a continental climate, and it gets very humid and hot and cold in winter, hot in summer, cold in winter, rains on and off, sometimes very heavily. And he lived in this very interesting landscape that was the Midwestern landscape, and wrote so lots of images about weather and rain, and throughout his songs he uses that as a constant metaphor. So they use language in different ways, but they complement each other, and they sort of were rivals in a way. Dylan wanted to be in a band, and John Lennon wanted to write more complex songs. So that was how they worked. They
never actually worked together, did they? I mean, there's only a few times that they met. I don't know if there was any chance of them working together. Is that right?
The first chapter is my account of their relationship, and they met a few times. I put them all in the book, and they also were in a studio twice but didn't record. Once in Lennon's home studio, once in a studio in New York, but didn't record together because I think they weren't friends. Bob Dylan was friends with George Harrison, very, very close friends, and they did work together. Dylan and Lennon, they were such big figures independently. They were more rivals, and they were massive fans of each other. And it's quite difficult. I've worked with people that I'm a fan of as a musician, and it takes a long time to feel comfortable in their presence, because if you're a fan of the person, you think of them in a different way to a normal human, although they are just normal humans. It just takes a while to get used to that, and I don't think they ever quite got over that. So they were associates rather than friends, as far as I know. They might have been on the phone to each other every day for all I know, but I don't think they were.
As far as we know, that's the way it was.
Yeah, as far as we know. I don't think. Yeah, I mean, who knows? Yoko's quite old now, so I don't think there's that much more to come out. But he did visit Yoko after Lennon was killed in her house, which shows that they had a closeness. And then later on, he wrote a song, "Roll On John," about John Lennon quite recently. So they did influence each other a lot. Yeah.
I heard you say before in another podcast that Dylan went to that. He actually did that National Trust tour that you talked about earlier.
That's right.
He didn't visit Paul's house. He only visited John's house.
He got off. Yeah. And no one knew. He got on the bus. He wears a sort of a hoodie, and he got on the bus and no one knew who he was. And then
no one recognised him.
And then gradually people worked out, I think, who he was. And he got off the bus before Paul's house. Perhaps it's very easy to read things into these stories. Perhaps he'd realised people knew who he was. The house caretaker certainly spotted him, and so perhaps he was like, "Okay, I've been rumbled. I'll get a cab back to the venue." Yeah. So yeah, I would have liked to have been on that bus. That would have been funny. Although you wouldn't be able to concentrate on visiting the John Lennon house. You'd be like, "I'm with Bob Dylan,"
Be like, which one do I look at?
Exactly. What do I? Oh my! Overload. The other interesting thing about Bob is that the landscape he grew up on is, and some listeners might be from sort of I grew up in an industrial area, Sheffield, in the north of England, and he grew up in a landscape that was part of an open cast mine, the biggest iron ore mine in the world at the time, I think. So an open cast mine is not like a mine that you sink into the ground. It's a mine where they just take the ground away. And some listeners might be familiar with that. They wouldn't do it much in the United Kingdom, because in England we don't have that much space. But in some countries where they have a lot of space, they'll just scoop away the ground to get to what they need underneath it. And so Dylan grew up in a town called Hibbing, which was surrounded by this open cast mine. So he had a very dramatic Midwestern landscape, but that was being ruined by the mining, just cut away. This huge, they called it the Grand Canyon of the North. If you know the Grand Canyon, it's a fantastic natural phenomenon. Well, this was that, but made by humans in industrial scale. And so his lyrics, his use of weather and nature and animals in his lyrics, I think is a reaction to that. And throughout his work, you see this kind of country and city challenge. And you might be familiar if you're from a rural area, but you live in a city now. There's very different. And I think that you can hear that in Bob Dylan's work a lot. Lots of his references to cars are about car crashes and danger and pollution. Most rock songs and pop songs about cars celebrate cars. They're, Route 66, get your kicks on Route 66. It's all about this road and cars being fantastic. It's the new form of travel and young people and cars. It's exciting. But most of Bob Dylan's reflections about metal are to do with, and cars and industry are to do with the sort of the dangerous side or the damage. So lots of car crashes or accidents, or the road is a sort of a lonely road.
Yeah.
So that's interesting in his work, that he's definitely a great advocate for nature, which I think has been overlooked a lot because people just think about his politics. And also very spiritual, like John as well. He had a full-on religious experience in the 1970s, and I believe has remained quite a spiritual person ever since. Like I said, I'm not really religious, but Bob Dylan certainly is. And almost every album since has had a song that's got a very strong spiritual content, at least one.
Do you know about that religious experience? Was there a specific thing that happened to him?
There's various stories, but it seems like somebody threw a cross, like a necklace cross, on stage when he picked it up. And it can be very lonely being in that world if you're a pop star. I think, especially if you're a solo artist like Bob was, or say Elvis Presley, you haven't got people you can bounce off. With the Beatles, John Lennon was in a gang, and then later he had Yoko Ono that he could be with and check ideas with. But if you're on your own, once you're that famous, you can't trust anybody that you meet because you don't know what their motives are. You can't trust their opinions because they're a fan, so they're not really treating you like a normal human. They'll say anything to be in your company. It's a fascinating psychological situation to be in. And so you're very much on your own. And often people like John Lennon stayed with their school friends for years as they kept the people who knew them before they were famous stayed their friends because they couldn't really trust anybody else once they'd been in the Beatles. And I think Dylan didn't really keep in touch with his childhood friends, so he was kind of on his own and has been quite a lot. Family was very important to Bob Dylan. He's possibly quite a bit more conservative than most people think. His early music's very political, but his later music is quite family oriented, and he's largely kept away from politics, and I think family's possibly important to him because it's the only people that he can trust is his children and his partner. And so he was just on the road and had a conversion moment. Yeah, he was in the hotel and then went to visit a church in California to talk it through with somebody, and it's gradual. People think of it as a sudden thing for Bob, but it was probably much more gradual, because he'd been using Bible quotes and characters from the Bible since the early 60s, and this happened in the late 1970s. So
yes,
the basic story is, Bob Dylan had a religious experience, but there are different types of religious experience. There are the sort of the flash ones, and then there are the gradual ones. An American psychologist, William James, I think his name was, very famously described those in the early 1900s. And most people think of Bob Dylan's as a St. Paul on the road to Damascus moment where something happens and then he becomes a Christian. But actually, probably what happened is it was much more gradual than that, in that gradually he just found that the Bible chapters that he'd been using in songs for stories suddenly had a deeper meaning to him. And when he did go to this church and talk to the pastor there, he said he had quite a profound knowledge of all this, as many people do in the United States. It's like I said earlier, it's an area where religion's very important, as it is across the world to different people, in different parts of the world.
Yes,
so, which is fair enough.
So he was probably quite steeped in sort of the Bible already, without having necessarily converted to Christianity.
He was Jewish, but he lived in a Midwestern town that didn't have a massive Jewish population, so he went to a regular school, and he was very familiar with both the Jewish texts, so the Old Testament and the Torah, and the New Testament, because that's what, in those days, a lot of people went to Sunday school. Even in the United Kingdom, John Lennon went to Sunday school and at his local church, and was a Cub Scout for a while, sang in the choir. That would have been interesting to get married in Walton Church Hall in Liverpool in 1954 and have a spotty teenage John Lennon singing in the choir as you were getting married.
Well, there'll be some old couples maybe still around. I don't know if that's possible, but maybe one or two old couples still around who they don't realise.
If you do ever visit Liverpool and you get in a taxi and it's an older taxi driver, you've always got to say to them, "Did you ever meet the Beatles?" Because they'll always have I knew John Lennon. Whether or not they did, they'll always say that, and they'll make up some story about, I used to drink with John Lennon. I knew Paul back in the day, and then now they're sort of an older guy driving a cab. They've all got those stories. I'm not sure how many are true.
Yeah. Even if it's not true, it'll still be worth hearing the story.
You get a bigger tip. From our taxi driver knew John Lennon. We gave him a nice tip. He told us a story. That's not no insult. Well, no insult to Liverpool taxi drivers. That's just in my
no, absolutely not. Yeah. No, I love Liverpool taxi drivers. I used to live in Liverpool, and I remember one particular day I had to hand in an essay, and it was like really the last minute. I had until 4 p.m. to get that essay, in, and I was printing it off at home. I had a very dodgy printer. And I got it all printed and stuff, and I leapt out into the street and flagged down a cab, and I said, "Get me to the university quick, I've got to hand this essay in." He was like, "All right, mate, strap in." And boom, off we went. He was driving down all the back streets on the way up to Mount Pleasant, where my university was based.
That's where John drank, up there. Yeah.
Yeah, those Beatle haunts and stuff, all those places where the Beatles would hang out. He was driving down these back streets, and he got me there in time, so I'm always always have good memories of Liverpool taxi drivers. Yeah,
those days are gone now. Because obviously I'm an academic, I work in a university, and you hand in work online. But at Sussex University, which used to be connected to my institution, they did have the 5 o'clock run, and they would have a little window, a little wooden serving hatch where you would hand in your work, and when the work was due, it would be 5 o'clock on a Friday or a Monday or whatever, and they close the door at 5 o'clock exactly, and you could watch students sprinting with the paper in their hand across the square to get to this window and try and get the paper in before it's shut on them at 5 o'clock. Yeah. But no, those days are gone now. It's all electronic, as you'll know if you're a student.
Yeah. I studied media and cultural studies, actually. And one of the modules I did modules on pop music back in the day. They were definitely the best modules, everyone's favourite subject. And we had a really good lecturer called Ron Moy.
I know the name, yeah.
It was just amazing. I wrote essays about music. You know him?
I know the name.
You know the name?
Yeah. I've been doing this for 20 years now, so I do know. Yeah, Liverpool has a big popular studies department. I was going to say the last thing. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say it was at Liverpool John Moores.
Yeah. Okay.
That's where I did that.
Yeah, I've been there a couple of times because I've worked at LIPA, and that John Moores was their institution, and their connected institution. Yeah. But the other thing that, in terms of, if you're studying English, there's an interesting John Lennon song called Norwegian Wood, which is one of those songs he wrote that was really influenced by Bob Dylan. So you can really hear he'd written lots of, I Want to Hold Your Hand type of love songs, and then he wrote this song that's much more oblique. It's much more abstract about a love affair. And it's called Norwegian Wood. And there's a film called Norwegian Wood from Japan, actually, that uses that title as well because of the song. And at that time, pine wood was just becoming popular in the United Kingdom as a type of furniture, which is why he calls it Norwegian Wood. And it's this sort of story of a love affair, but it's all done very poetically. Of course, wood is a natural metaphor. It's a natural thing, right? So it just draws on, you can tell he's been listening to Bob Dylan. And Bob Dylan thought this was so transparent. At this point, he'd done 3 or 4 songs like this, that Bob Dylan wrote. He visited John's house in the summer of 66, and then wrote a song to say to John, stop stealing my stuff. And that's called Fourth Time Around, and that's on the Blonde on Blonde album. And there's a line, it really freaked John Lennon out, because he was like, oh no, he's onto me. And he visited John's house, and one of the lines is, I didn't ask for your crutch being a sort of a thing obviously you use if you have a bad leg to carry you. I didn't ask for your crutch, don't ask for mine. And because it's Bob Dylan, you're not quite sure what it's about, but it's basically rewriting Norwegian Wood, the tune, with these song lyrics directed at John Lennon. And then one of the lines is the picture of you in your wheelchair. And John had a picture of him in a wheelchair, probably the one from the film Help. So Bob Dylan had visited John's house for one night and seen this picture and written a song to John about a picture of him that he'd seen in his house, that he might have pointed it out at the time, but who knows. So you can understand why John was like, oh my God, this guy's getting right inside my head. So they wrote songs about each other throughout their career, which is interesting too. There's quite a lot of question and answer songs in pop music, and that's one. There's a couple like that they wrote about each other. John Lennon wrote a song about John after he'd had his religious experience called Serve Yourself, which is based on John's song on Bob's song Serve Somebody. Bob Dylan wrote a religious song, Serve Somebody, and John Lennon turned it into Serve Yourself. So yeah, quite a complex relationship really, but played out in language between them.
John name checks Dylan as well in the song God, doesn't he? Where
Yes.
he's listing all the things he doesn't believe in. And he sort of names him Zimmerman, which is his proper name, his original name. So it's quite a cutting thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's
fascinating, really. Quite a complex relationship. So
absolutely. So just before we finish, I mean, you mentioned there the sort of the experiences of being a pop star and stuff. I mean, you've had that experience as well. Because I remember your band Sleeper when I was a teenager in the 90s. I saw you on TV. You were on Top of the Pops and stuff, and you were on the radio. The band was part of a movement called Britpop.
Yep.
So I don't know what. Got any stories?
Well, yeah.
Got any Britpop stories?
Britpop happened largely because of the Beatles, really. So everybody, if you know pop music and you know American music from the early 90s, everybody was listening to a type of rock called grunge and a band called Nirvana. And then very sadly Kurt Cobain passed away, and it was time. Everybody knew something different was going to happen, and there'd been a few bands in the United Kingdom that were more influenced by British music, particularly the Beatles from the 60s, the Kinks and the Beatles and bands like that. And so there was a sort of explosion of British bands influenced by 60s music and 60s and 70s British music, really. And I'd formed a band when I was at university with Louise, who's the singer of Sleeper, and she's just a natural pop star, really. So I was very lucky in that I met a person who was just a natural born front person for a band, and asked her to form a band with me, and she said yes, and then was just hanging on the coattails for the next 5 years, trying not to mess it up, really. My favourite story is after, I mean, we got to play, there's a famous musician called Elvis Costello, and we got to tour America with him, which was fantastic. And largely because we got to watch him play every night. We were the first band on. But he covered one of our songs. There's a song called What Do I Do Now that he did a version of, which I helped. Well, it's Louise's song, but I played on the original and sort of helped arrange it with Andy the drummer, or contributed to it in some way. So to have a song that you've been a part of, then recorded by a bit of a legendary artist like him, that was amazing. And then after the band, I went to America for a few years and played with an artist called K.D. Lang, or played on one of her records, I should say. And when I came back to London one time to see Louise and Andy from Sleeper, they were working in George Michael's studio.
The famous George Michael.
Yeah.
Yes.
And he sings back in... We put that record out last year.
Oh, really?
It's a sort of a lost songs album. And it's got George Michael singing back on vocals on some of it. And he just bought the Imagine piano that John Lennon wrote and played Imagine on, and it was in his studio in Highgate.
So you worked with George Michael.
Louise and Andy did, yeah.
Louise and Andy did, and you came in to visit. You were in George Michael's studio, and he had bought the Imagine piano, the piano that John Lennon wrote Imagine on. Yes,
and recorded. Yeah, and it's not the big white one. It's an upright. It's a brown upright piano. And so we were just like, Andy was like, you got to get over here. There's the Imagine pianos here. And I was like, oh my God. So I jumped in a cab, but chatting to the cab driver, London cab driver, never met the Beatles, and got to the studio, and we were just taking pictures and everything. And I had a denim jacket on with a metal button just on the cuff. And the very last picture we did, I sort of hugged the piano. I said, this is the greatest day of my life. And I hugged the piano and stroked it across the top. And as I did, the metal button on my denim jacket cuff just put a scratch right across the top of it, a deep one against the grain. I felt it go. I felt it digging in. I was like, oh my God, it was like £1.4 million. He'd just bought it. I was like, oh my God, I've scratched the Imagine piano. So it went from being my greatest ever day to my worst. And it's still there. So the guy, George wasn't there. George was on the way in to the studio.
He was on, yeah.
And
did he notice?
No, the engineer said he won't notice. He was smoking a lot of cannabis at the time. He said he'll be stoned when he gets here. He won't know. And I said, should I tell him? I'll tell him. I'll just be honest and I'll just say what happened. And they said, no, you don't need to. He's not gonna notice. So it does have other marks on it. John Lennon would leave cigarettes on the side of the piano and they'd burn away, and so the cigarette burns on it and scuffs on the bottom of it. But the top's quite clean. So it's now under a glass case, so no idiot like me can touch it ever again. It's in the Liverpool Museum. It's in Strawberry Fields Museum in Liverpool, under a glass case with my scratch across the top. And it's about elbow length in from the side. So if you visit, you'll see a scratch right across the top, just about that far in, length of my elbow. Exactly that far in, the length of my elbow to my cuff. And it's about 6 or 7 inches gouge across the top. And
so
now under a glass case, protected. And everyone thinks, I guess they must think John Lennon did it, but no, that was this idiot, sadly. Yeah, damaged.
You left your mark on the world of pop music in several ways.
It's the most expensive thing I've ever damaged, and I'm quite clumsy, so I've had lots of bumps in cars. But
that's great.
Yeah, so like my pop career has basically just been trying not to mess things up for everybody else in my band. This is the book's the only thing I've ever done by myself. So.
Well, it's great. So I guess people can get it in all the usual bookshops, right?
It's quite cheap. It's an academic book. It's Cambridge University Press, but it's quite cheap. It's like 20 quid. And you can get it on digital versions as well. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, brilliant. John, thank you so much for talking to me and my audience and describing the things you've talked about.
You're very welcome,
very
Luke.
interesting.
Any time. If people enjoy it, I'll happily come back. We could talk about songs and how songs, lyrics work in songs and stuff and things like that.
Absolutely.
And this is a great podcast. You've done really well. It's my partner teaches Japanese, so I know a good language teacher, and you've done a great job. If you're listening to this, well done. You found a good teacher.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that. Okay, right. Well, have a lovely day and keep in touch.
Yeah, we'll do. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Nice one. Thanks, mate. Bye-bye.